You know what's wild? There are people walking around right now with $500,000 in the bank who are absolutely convinced they can't retire. Meanwhile, there are others with the exact same amount who quit their jobs last year and haven't looked back. Same number, completely different realities. So what's actually going on here? Let's cut through the noise, because this question, can you retire on $500,000, has become one of the most debated topics in personal finance. And the answer isn't what most financial advisors will tell you. It's not a simple yes or no. It's something far more interesting and honestly more useful once you understand how this actually works. Here's what nobody talks about. The retirement industry has spent decades convincing you that you need some massive number to stop working. 2 million, 3 million, sometimes more. They throw around these figures like they're carved in stone, handed down from some financial mountaintop. But when you actually dig into the math, when you look at real people living real lives, the picture gets a lot more complicated and a lot more hopeful. I've spent years analyzing early retirement strategies, talking to people who've actually done it, and I can tell you this much. Some people are thriving on $500,000 while others are miserable with 3 times that amount. The difference isn't luck. It's not about being cheap or living in a van. It's about understanding a few critical concepts that most people never even consider. Let's start with the elephant in the room. $500,000 sounds like an enormous amount of money, right? It is. Most Americans will never see that much in their bank account at one time. But here's the psychological trap that gets everyone. The moment you start thinking about retirement, that number suddenly feels small, inadequate, scary even. Your brain does this weird thing where it imagines 40 years of expenses stretching out into infinity. You picture every possible disaster. Medical emergencies, market crashes, inflation eating away at your purchasing power, and suddenly $500,000 feels like pocket change. This is what I call retirement anxiety syndrome, and it's completely divorced from mathematical reality. The traditional retirement rule, the one your parents probably followed, says you need to replace about 80% of your pre-retirement income. So if you're making $75,000 a year, you'd need $60,000 annually in retirement. Using the famous 4% rule, which we'll get into later, that means you'd need $1.5 million saved, not $500,000. This is where most people stop thinking and just assume early retirement is impossible for them. But what if I told you that 80% replacement ratio is based on assumptions that probably don't apply to you? That 4% rule? It was designed for a completely different type of retiree than someone pursuing financial independence in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. The entire framework is built for people retiring at 65 and living maybe 25 more years. You're potentially looking at a 40 or 50-year retirement. Different game entirely. The first thing you need to understand is that retirement spending isn't linear. This blows people's minds when they first encounter it. We've been conditioned to think that if we spend $50,000 a year now, we'll spend $50,000 a year forever, adjusted for inflation. Real life doesn't work that way, not even close. Research shows that retirees typically spend less as they age, a lot less. There's even a name for this, the retirement spending smile. You spend more in your early retirement years when you're healthy and active. Travel, hobbies, all that deferred gratification finally getting released. Then spending drops significantly in your middle retirement years. You've done the traveling, you've bought the things. Life settles into a rhythm. Finally, spending can tick back up in your final years due to healthcare costs, though this isn't guaranteed and is heavily dependent on your specific situation. What does this mean for your $500,000? It means that number might need to work a lot less hard than you think. If you're planning to spend $40,000 a year for the next 50 years, you're not actually planning correctly, because you probably won't spend $40,000 a year for 50 years. Maybe you spend $45,000 for the first 10 years, $30,000 for the next 20, and then who knows what happens after that. The math changes completely. Now let's talk about something that makes financial advisors uncomfortable. The idea that you might actually earn money in retirement. I know. The whole point is to stop working, right? But here's the reality. Most early retirees I know do something, not because they have to, but because they want to. They consult, they start small businesses, they monetize hobbies, they work seasonally. This isn't about being forced back into the grind. It's about having the freedom to pursue interesting opportunities without needing them to cover your entire cost of living. When you have $500,000 invested and it's generating returns, even modest additional income completely transforms the equation. If your investments are covering 70% of your expenses and you're bringing in the other 30% doing something you actually enjoy, you're not really working. You're living. And this brings us to the most important concept in this entire discussion. One that will determine whether $500,000 is enough for you or whether even $2 million wouldn't be sufficient. It's not about the number in your account. It's about the gap between what you have coming in and what you need going out. This gap is everything. It's the difference between financial independence and financial anxiety. Think about it this way. If your investments generate $20,000 per year and you need $60,000 to live, you've got a problem. That's a $40,000 gap you need to fill somehow. But if your investments generate $20,000 and you only need $25,000 to live your ideal life, you've only got a $5,000 gap. Suddenly the math looks completely different. You could cover that gap with the most casual part-time work imaginable. Or maybe your spending naturally dips below $20,000 in lower-cost years. This is why two people with identical net worth can have completely different retirement realities. One person has engineered their life to cost less without feeling deprived. The other is locked into high fixed costs and can't figure out why they feel trapped despite having money in the bank. Your burn rate matters more than your account balance, but there's something else happening here that nobody wants to acknowledge. The entire concept of traditional retirement might be fundamentally flawed for people pursuing financial independence young. You're not trying to stop being productive. You're trying to escape mandatory productivity. You're not trying to do nothing. You're trying to have the freedom to do anything. This distinction changes everything about how you think about money. When you realize you're not saving to do nothing forever, you're saving to buy choice, the entire framework shifts. You don't need enough money to fund 50 years of complete idleness. You need enough money to say no to things that drain you and yes to things that energize you. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. Sarah has $500,000 invested. She's 38 years old. Her investments generate roughly $20,000 annually on average, though this fluctuates. Her basic living expenses run about $35,000 per year. On paper, she's got a $15,000 shortfall. A traditional financial advisor would tell her she can't retire. She needs to keep working her corporate job for another decade, maybe two, until the numbers work. But Sarah doesn't think about it that way. She left her job anyway. Now she does freelance consulting, maybe 10 hours a week. She makes $18,000 a year doing this, some years more, some years less. She's completely covered her gap with work she actually enjoys on her own schedule. Is she retired? Technically, no. Is she financially independent? Absolutely. She could stop the consulting tomorrow and adjust her spending slightly, or she could keep doing it because she likes it. The choice is hers. This is what financial independence actually looks like for most people. It's not about hitting some magic number and never earning another dollar. It's about reaching a point where you have options, where you can take risks because you have a cushion, where you can turn down opportunities that don't align with your values because you don't need them. But let's address the elephant in the room. What about emergencies? What about market crashes? What about all the things that can go wrong when you're living off investments? Valid concerns. Let's talk about them. The biggest fear people have is running out of money because the market tanks right after they retire. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's a real thing. If you retire in 2007, right before the financial crisis, your first few years of withdrawals happen while your portfolio is getting hammered. This can permanently damage your long-term prospects because you're selling assets at depressed prices to fund your living expenses. How do you protect against this? Several ways. First, you don't invest everything in stocks. A balanced portfolio with bonds and cash gives you options. When stocks are down, you live off your bonds or cash reserves instead of selling stocks at a loss. Second, you stay flexible with your spending. If the market crashes, maybe that's not the year you take an expensive international trip. You adjust. This is where having a lower cost of living becomes a superpower. If you need $80,000 a year to survive, you can't really adjust much when times get tough. If your baseline is $30,000 and you normally spend $40,000, you've got room to maneuver. Third, and this is crucial, you maintain the ability to earn money, even if you don't want to, even if you hope you never have to. The simple fact that you could pick up some work if absolutely necessary is a form of insurance that doesn't cost anything until you need it. Think about what this means practically. You've got $500,000 invested. The market drops 30%. Suddenly, you're looking at $350,000. Scary, right? But you're not forced to sell anything if you have other options. You tighten your belt for a year. Maybe you pick up a short-term project. You let your portfolio recover. Within a few years, you're back to where you were, possibly higher. Compare this to someone still locked in the traditional working world. They experience the same market crash, but they can't do anything about it except watch their 401k statement and feel anxious. They're still spending the same amount, still trapped in the same job, still years away from having any freedom. You, on the other hand, have choices. That's the difference money buys you, not the ability to spend whatever you want whenever you want. The ability to adapt and respond to changing circumstances without panic. Now let's talk about healthcare, because this is the thing that terrifies Americans more than anything else about early retirement. How do you afford health insurance without an employer? It's expensive, no question. A family can easily pay $1,500 per month or more for decent coverage. That's $18,000 a year just for the privilege of not going bankrupt if someone gets sick. But here's what most people don't realize. When you're not earning much income because you're living off investments, you often qualify for substantial subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. Your income for subsidy purposes is based on realized capital gains and dividends, not your net worth. You could have $1 million invested and still qualify for premium assistance if your actual taxable income is low enough. I'm not saying to structure your entire financial life around gaming the healthcare subsidy system. I'm saying the math isn't as terrifying as it first appears when you actually run the numbers for your specific situation. Plus, if you're really concerned, you can factor healthcare costs into your annual budget. That $35,000 spending target becomes $45,000 when you include insurance premiums. Still achievable with $500,000 and modest additional income. The point is, healthcare costs are a known variable. They're predictable. You can plan for them. They're not some unknowable monster that makes early retirement impossible. What is unknowable? How you'll actually feel once you have the freedom to structure your days however you want. Some people absolutely thrive. They finally have time for all the projects and interests they've been putting off. Others spiral into depression because they realize work was providing structure and purpose they didn't know they needed. This is the psychological side of financial independence that numbers can't capture. Which brings us to something nobody talks about in the financial independence community: What happens when you actually get there and realize you have no idea what to do with yourself? I've seen this pattern repeat dozens of times. Someone grinds for years, hits their number, quits their job, and then 6 months later they're more miserable than when they were working. Not because of money, because they built their entire identity around achieving financial independence, and once they got it, the goal disappeared. They won the game and suddenly realized they never thought about what comes after winning. This is why I'm deeply skeptical of people who treat early retirement as the ultimate destination. It's not a destination, it's a tool. The question isn't whether you can retire at 30 or 40 or 50. The question is what you'll do with the freedom once you have it. Because freedom without purpose is just expensive boredom. Let me tell you about someone I know who retired at 38 with about $600,000. Seemed set. Ran the numbers. Everything looked solid. 3 years later, he went back to work, not because he ran out of money, because he was going insane sitting around the house. His wife was still working, his friends were still working. He'd go to the gym at 10 in the morning and it was just him and the retirees in their 70s. He'd plan elaborate trips and realize he didn't actually want to travel alone while everyone else was busy. The freedom he'd sacrificed everything for felt like isolation. Now contrast that with someone else I know who hit financial independence at 42 and immediately started a nonprofit. Doesn't pay much. Doesn't need to. She's doing work she actually cares about without worrying whether it's profitable. That's what the money bought her, not retirement. Options. Here's what I think most people actually want when they say they want to retire early. They want the option to say no. They want to stop doing work that feels meaningless. They want control over their schedule. They want to pursue projects that might not be lucrative but are personally fulfilling. None of that requires complete retirement. It just requires enough money to not be desperate. This is where the conversation usually shifts to something called barista fire. The idea is you save enough that your investments cover most of your expenses, then you work some low-stress job that covers the gap and provides health insurance. Maybe you work part-time at a bookstore. Maybe you do freelance consulting a few months a year. Maybe you teach yoga classes because you actually enjoy it. The math here is fascinating because it completely changes the equation. Instead of needing 25 times your annual spending, you might only need 10 or 15 times your baseline expenses. Let's say you need $40,000 a year to live. Traditional retirement planning says you need $1 million. But what if you earn $15,000 a year doing something you don't hate? Now you only need $625,000 invested to cover the remaining $25,000. That's achievable years earlier. But there's a trap here too. Some people use barista fire as an excuse to undershoot their savings target. They tell themselves they'll work part-time indefinitely, then discover at 55 that nobody wants to hire them for those casual jobs they thought would always be available. Or their body stops cooperating. Or they just get tired of working after doing it for 30 years already. The smart move is to save as if you'll need full financial independence, then treat any additional income as a bonus that extends your runway even further. Don't plan on working forever. Plan to have the option to work if you want to. Big difference, which brings us back to that original question. Can you actually retire on $500,000? The technically correct answer is yes, under specific conditions with careful planning and realistic expectations. The more honest answer is that most people asking this question are really asking something else. They're asking if they can escape a job they hate, if they can stop feeling trapped by their paycheck, if they can start making choices based on what they actually want instead of what they can afford. And that's a different question entirely. Because you don't necessarily need $500,000 to do those things. You might need better boundaries at work. You might need to switch careers. You might need to cut your expenses so you're not living paycheck to paycheck. You might need to build up 6 months of savings so you can take risks without immediately facing catastrophe. The danger of fixating on a specific number is that it makes everything binary. Either you have enough or you don't. Either you're financially independent or you're trapped. Real life doesn't work that way. Financial freedom exists on a spectrum. Every dollar you save expands your options slightly. Every month of expenses you have covered buys you a little more breathing room. Someone with $50,000 saved has more freedom than someone with nothing. Not retirement freedom, but the freedom to quit a toxic job without having another one lined up. The freedom to take a month off between positions. The freedom to negotiate harder because walking away is actually possible. Someone with $200,000 has even more options. Maybe they can take a year off to retrain for a different career. Maybe they can start a business without immediately needing it to be profitable. Maybe they can move to a cheaper city and live off savings while they figure out their next move. These intermediate stages of financial freedom matter just as much as the final destination. Maybe more, because they're achievable years earlier and they start improving your life immediately instead of at some distant point in the future when you finally hit your magic number. So here's what I actually recommend instead of obsessing over whether $500,000 is enough. Build your savings as aggressively as you can without making yourself miserable today. Track your spending so you know your real number, not some fantasy version where you suddenly become a different person who never wants anything. And most importantly, start experimenting with the life you think you want long before you have the money to fund it permanently. That last part is crucial and almost nobody does it. People spend decades saving for retirement, then discover they hate the reality of not working. Or they realize the hobbies they thought would fill their time are actually boring after 2 weeks. Or they move to their dream location and find out they miss their old community. You can test drive early retirement right now without quitting your job. Take a 1-month sabbatical if your company allows it. Use all your vacation time at once. See what you actually do with unstructured time when nobody is paying you to show up anywhere. Pay attention to how you feel on day 3 versus day 20. Some people discover they love it. Others realize they'd be bored senseless within a month. Both answers are valuable before you make an irreversible decision. The same applies to location. Thinking about retiring somewhere cheap, rent there for 3 months first. Don't just visit for a week when you're in vacation mode. Actually live there. Shop for groceries, deal with the internet speed, experience the healthcare system. See if you can build a social circle or if you're completely isolated. I know someone who retired to a beautiful, cheap town in Portugal. Gorgeous weather, low cost of living, everything looked perfect on paper. He lasted 8 months before moving back. Turns out he hated being that far from his kids and grandkids. The money part worked great, the life part didn't. That's a $500,000 lesson you can learn for the cost of a 3-month rental. Here's something else worth considering. The 4% rule assumes you're retiring at 65 and need your money to last 30 years. But what if you're planning to retire at 40? Now you need it to last 50 years, maybe 60. The safe withdrawal rate drops to something like 3%, maybe even 2.5% if you want to be really conservative. Suddenly, that $500,000 only generates $12,500 annually in safe withdrawals. That changes everything. Unless you're planning to work part-time indefinitely, or you have other income sources, or you're willing to accept higher risk, early retirement requires significantly more money than traditional retirement. This is why most early retirees don't actually stop working completely. They shift to lower stress, more flexible work that they enjoy. They consult. They build small businesses. They do freelance projects. The goal isn't to never earn money again. It's to never be forced to earn money in ways they hate. And that brings up something important about the psychology of all this. Having enough money to retire and actually retiring are two completely different things. I've met people with $2 million saved who still feel like they don't have enough to quit. I've met others with $300,000 who retired comfortably and never looked back. The difference isn't the money, it's their relationship with risk and uncertainty. Some people need absolute certainty before they'll make a move. Others are comfortable with ambiguity and course-correcting as they go. Neither approach is wrong, but you need to understand which type you are before you make major life decisions based on financial models. The real question isn't whether you can retire on $500,000. It's whether you can build a life you don't need to retire from. That sounds like motivational poster nonsense, but stick with me. If you hate your job so much that you're counting down the years until you can escape, you're going to be miserable for decades, even if you successfully save enough to retire early. But if you can find work that doesn't make you want to drive into oncoming traffic, suddenly the timeline pressure disappears. You're not desperately trying to hit a number so you can finally start living. You're already living, and the savings are just making that life progressively more flexible and secure. This is why I'm skeptical of extreme frugality approaches where people live on rice and beans for 15 years so they can retire at 35. Sure, it works mathematically, but you've just traded 15 years of your youth for financial independence at an age when you still have to figure out what to do with all that free time. Meanwhile, someone who found work they actually enjoy and saved moderately might reach financial independence at 45 and feel zero regret about those extra 10 years because they weren't suffering through them. The optimal strategy probably lies somewhere in the middle. Save aggressively enough that you're making real progress in building security, but not so aggressively that you're miserable today in exchange for some theoretical future happiness. Keep your fixed expenses low so you have flexibility. Build skills that let you earn money in multiple ways. Cultivate relationships and interests that aren't tied to your paycheck. And yeah, save that $500,000 if you can. It won't solve every problem or answer every question, but it'll give you options that most people never have. And options are really what we're buying when we save money. Not certainty. Not guaranteed happiness, just the ability to make choices based on what we want instead of what we can afford. That's worth saving for, whatever your number ends up being. So can you retire on $500,000? Maybe. Depends on what retirement actually means to you. If you're picturing endless leisure with zero financial stress, probably not unless your expenses are extremely low or you're comfortable with some part-time work. If you're picturing freedom to choose what you do with your time without being desperate for a paycheck, then yeah, $500,000 could absolutely get you there. The real answer is that $500,000 isn't a destination. It's a tool. What matters is what you build with it, your burn rate, your flexibility, your ability to adapt when things don't go according to plan. Your willingness to stay engaged with the world in some productive capacity even if you don't need the money. Stop obsessing over whether you have enough. Start building the life you want right now with whatever resources you currently have. The money will follow or it won't, but at least you won't wake up at 65 with a big pile of savings and absolutely no idea what you actually enjoy doing. That's the real retirement crisis nobody talks about. Not having enough money is fixable. Not knowing what you want, that's harder to solve, and no amount of money makes it easier.